I would like to welcome Rachel Davis from UC Davis Public Garden and Arboretum to introduce the program and today's guest presenters. Rachel represents UC Davis Public Garden and Arboretum in the Plants and Climate Change Education Peer Learning Group, which explores how botanic gardens and arboreta can maximize the impact of plant-centered climate change education. Over to you, Rachel.
Hi, everyone. I am happy to introduce our guest speakers today, Sarah May Nelson and Greg Ira. They're going to talk to us through the lens of the California Naturalist Program and the UC Climate Stewards Program. So within the University of California, we have this Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources, which is a great source for the entire network and for the public to find really helpful research for things like climate change education. So in collaboration with partners, including formal and informal science institutions, they deliver a public course that involves climate change literacy and civic engagement for community and ecosystem resilience throughout California. Sarah May Nelson is the UC Climate Stewards Initiative Academic Coordinator. She's an educator, science communicator, and climate change communication specialist who draws on her background and interest in interpretation in informal science education centers. She's a member of the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, the National Association for Interpretation, and the UN Education, Communication, and Outreach Stakeholders Community. She was also recognized by President Obama in 2015 as a champion of change in climate change education and literacy. Greg Ira is the director of the California Naturalist statewide program, developing and overseeing efficient and effective program operations through program planning, development, management, and evaluation. Greg has over 20 years of experience in design, delivery, and management of environmental education programs and professional development. In addition to program management, Greg's interests include inquiry-based environmental education, participatory science, program design with cultural competency, and advancing collective impact approaches to complex and large-scale challenges. Welcome, Sarah May and Greg.
Thanks for that introduction. We're both really happy to be here, and hopefully we're able to share a little bit of the experience we've had in the last several years as we've rolled out a new program, a new course within our program called Climate Stewards. But just I'll start off with a little bit of background, and then I'll turn it over to the person behind this great course that we're offering, Sarah May Nelson, and she'll get you into the nuts and bolts. The Climate Stewards course that we'll talk about is housed within a larger program that started over 10 years ago called the California Naturalist Program. And even within that program, we started the process of operationalizing DEIJ in our work. And that's carried over as we've grown to add the new Climate Stewards course. The two courses are essentially typically they're a 10-week course with over 40 hours of contact time, and the courses share a kind of an infrastructure, if you will, that we established with the California Naturalist Program. That infrastructure includes the way we deliver the courses through local partner organizations that we train. It includes our volunteer management system, the way we share information with our partners, how we set course requirements. All of those things are a standard platform that both of these courses fit on. Another area of standardization for our program is our mission, and I'll go to the next slide. This is really to foster a diverse community of naturalists and stewards to promote the stewardship of California's environment and natural resources through education and service. So it's we commonly refer to these courses as education and service courses. They're really designed not only to provide information, but to engage people actively through civic processes and local participation in resource management and sustainability. We have for both of the courses a set of guiding principles, and I'm going to walk through these fairly quickly. These do relate in many ways to our efforts related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in our program, but they're really the values and the culture of our program that we want people to recognize. So when they think of the California Naturalist Program, when they think of the Climate Stewards course, these kind of values and characteristics will hopefully come to mind. So I'll try to walk through these fairly quickly. Most of them I think are probably familiar to you or self-explanatory. We're really trying to get beyond just memorizing the little bits of information related to either natural history or to climate change, and really emphasize the relationships of the parts and looking at the whole system, and recognizing that it's very complex, and we have to use a systems thinking approach to really capture these relationships because they're vital, even more so than just the individual parts of our programs. We also recognize that our learners, our course participants experience what they learn, not only intellectually, but physically and emotionally and mentally. This is a recognition that the whole person is critical in the way that we deliver our courses. We also know, and Sarah May will touch on this much more, that that our courses have are existing within a context of experiences that our course participants have gone through in their lives, many of which in recent years have been very traumatic. So understanding the social and emotional burden that goes along with teaching complex and often difficult subjects, as well as addressing the experiences, often traumatic, that our audience have gone through. These are other characteristics that we try to address as we deliver our courses. Obviously, for any type of program that deals with the environment and local communities, the importance of place is critical. So we kind of like this term place-shaped. The experiences that people have related to natural resources or the climate change are shaped by those local experiences that they've encountered in their areas. So recognizing that and elevating that is another piece of our program's guiding principles. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Local and cultural relevance will come up in a few other slides down the road. We recognize that that justice, equity, diversity, inclusion are not just an important part of what we need to cover in our courses, but it's morally, it's something that we have to address. We recognize that climate change is a threat multiplier, and that includes threats like inequities in our society. And we understand that there will be disproportionate impacts on certain groups. So understanding all of that really requires us to put justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion front and center in our efforts to deliver our programs. We also recognize that while most of us are steeped in kind of Western scientific traditions, we recognize that there's local and indigenous knowledge that also brings value to our programs. And we acknowledge, respect, and recognize those other ways of knowing and thinking as we move forward to develop courses in collaboration with our partners. The way we do that is through a co-design process where we work together, starting with our core curriculum, but working with the strengths, the interests, the needs, and the priorities of our local partners that will actually deliver our courses to tailor the course to those local and cultural needs of their audiences. So this co-design process is built into all the development of all of our courses around the state. I think I've talked a little bit about this. This slide goes into some different levels of equity, procedural and distributional and structural. These are other levels of equity that we highlight in our courses. So how are the benefits and burdens distributed? Who's eligible to participate? What are the underlying structures that that create inequities that we see currently in our society, and how do those affect the content and the work that we do. So just very quickly, this is a framework that we use to kind of put into context our justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. We start with our organization's principles of community. Those kind of lay out for all of our programs in UC A&R what our organization's values are. Then we kind of layer in the goals of our program and our specific courses. And then we look at our actions, and from there, we're able to come up with this kind of overarching framework for JEDI. One important part that we came up with, because we struggled to get all of our team on the same page, thinking about how we operationalize these concepts. And we wanted to come up with a framework that everyone on our team would be able to understand and use and articulate with others when they're talking about what we do in our program and how we actually do that. We came up with this 4 R's approach, which essentially looks at the relationships and the importance of relationships, building relationships with organizations that we may not have partnered with. This is especially important in a program like ours that's delivered by partners. So building and broadening relationships with organizations that we may not have reached in the past is central, and recognizing that's a long-term process and not something that we can just throw in the microwave and bake and be ready to move on the next day. Relevance is getting back to this idea of making sure our content is locally relevant and culturally relevant. And that's where that co-design process comes into play. The co-design process is that systematic and intentional process of working with our local partners to tailor our core curriculum to make it relevant. Recruitment deals really with barriers to participation. And we're looking at everything from our course costs to when our courses are offered, where they're offered, what format of delivery we're offering them in. All of those things fall under barriers to recruitment and participation. The last one deals with responsibility. This is kind of internally, looking internally at ourselves and asking, are we holding ourselves accountable? Do we have metrics for measuring the progress that we're making in these areas? Are we doing our own due diligence and staff professional development? All of these things are part of kind of taking responsibility, looking internally, asking ourselves, are we, walking the walk as we go down this path? So this is the 4 R's framework that we use. The next thing here, these just go into more detail and provide additional examples for those topics, those 4 R's that I just gave you. You can see there some examples of ways we've built relationships with other types of organizations. I'm not going to read these off, but one of them, workforce development organizations, have been a tremendous partnership for our program. Working with tribal organizations at different levels has also been critical for us to broaden participation. Seeking out organizations that already have an environmental justice mission is another approach that we've used successfully. And then I'll just add that community colleges really are a much better reflection of the diversity of our state. And by partnering with our community colleges, we're moving forward with relationships that help us reach a broader audience. Here again, and I've talked about this already, relevance it really focuses on place and local culture. So all of our courses, as they're co-designed, will look at local examples. This comes out in the field trips that they take in their courses, but that also talks about the audience that they serve. This may be a rural and urban audience. This may be a primarily retired audience or a primarily young pre-college audience. All of these factors go into this question of relevance in our program. This is probably an overly complicated flow chart of how we take our core curriculum, partner with organizations that we're working with, do an instructor training, and then at the end of that instructor training, the instructor understands all the requirements of the course, but then they go on to tailor that curriculum, that syllabus that they're going to use so that it's locally and culturally relevant. And then they go on to deliver the course to their audience and then eventually refine that based on evaluation results. And then that process continues again when they go on to offer the course in the future. I mentioned these barriers to recruitment already. I think they're all listed there. I think you're all familiar with those. Responsibility, I've talked about several of these things that we're doing internally to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable for progress in this area. I think setting up consistent program metrics in this regard are important, and we're just completing a survey that was not a survey, it was an analysis of data from multiple surveys that we've used in the past to capture some of our progress on reaching a broader demographic in our state. All right.
So now it's my turn.
I'll turn it over to Sarah May. Hopefully I left her some time and she can run through some additional details on the program.
Yeah, thanks so much, Greg. So Greg has kind of really contextualized what I'm about to share with you. So the next several slides are kind of how we've built in these issues of relationships, relevance, recruitment, and responsibility into the courses we offer and some of the materials that we offer to our instructors. And one of the ways that we do that is we encourage community agreements. And this actually slide that you're seeing here was a community agreement developed by one of our instructors that I have brought in and started using in my classes because I really appreciate the structure that Lacey Gerhart-Barley, our instructor at Wild Davis, put together for this. And the idea behind a lot of this is relationships. So when we enter into these spaces as an instructor or facilitator, an interpreter or communicator, you know, there's the great saying about the sage on the stage. And a lot of work in recent years has been to move away from that into more communal relationship discussion related spaces of inquiry and other types of learning. And so establishing how we will be in community with each other really sets an important tone. So just like Emily did at the very top of this meeting, kind of setting the tone for the space that we're occupying together. And continuing on from that, because climate change can be a quite crunchy issue in a lot of different places, we also bring in some of these discussion agreements, which have been adapted from the National Equity Project, which again were brought forward by one of our community members, Joanna Flor Tavares, who again, I thought they were such a great incorporation that I brought into my spaces. And this is really acknowledging that with big topics, with socially intense topics, with emotionally important topics, we have a lot of big feelings. And it's okay to have big feelings, but we really need to understand how we address those big feelings in the shared spaces. And recently, I saw this placed in the best language I've seen for a long time, and it says, all emotions are welcome, but not all behaviors are welcome. So the fact that we're experiencing things, we're feeling things, we bring things with us into these shared spaces, we acknowledge that, but these community agreements and discussion agreements set the stage for how we are going to interact with each other in community around these topics. That being said, another thing that we have found is increasingly important especially as we work with these increasingly diverse communities, communities that are trending younger. So naturalist programs across the country tend to trend a little bit older, with a lot of retirees or older middle-aged adults. But around the topics of climate change, we're finding that more and more young millennials as well as Gen Z are really engaged in these topics. And one of the things that's become really important in these conversation spaces is sharing a positionality or identity statement. And basically what that does is that tells your audience where you're coming from. And this is my, Sarah Mae Nelson's, personal positionality statement. I let folks know that when I'm talking to them, I'm presenting the facts and my own interpretation of the facts clearly and distinctly, that I'm fact checking to the best of my ability the information that I'm teaching that day. I'm asking them to be respectful with me as I will be respectful with them. And then the last bullet point, again, is letting them know that when I am talking, I am coming from the position of a white, neurodiverse, heterosexual, ex-millennial, cis female climate change communication specialist. And it truly is remarkable. I've seen it most in our younger audiences, especially a lot of the workforce development stuff that we're doing now, how grateful folks are for understanding where you're coming from, and also for you acknowledging openly where you are coming from in the wider discussion that's happening in these spaces. And this is all interconnected again with relationships. And what we're finding, especially as relates to DEIJ relationships throughout our communities, is how critical the social influence of trusted messengers is. A lot of social science and social psychology has gone into topics like climate change, education, interpretation, and communication. And one of the things that we very clearly know is that who we trust as individuals is directly related to your education, your age, your religious preferences, your location in the world, as well as your racial or ethnic identities. And as a side note, who you trust on climate change has an interesting relationship among all of those different factors. But in general, we tend to trust the people who are most like us and who are in positions of authority in places that we identify with. And so, as Greg said, we're building relationships with these organizations across our state. California is gigantic. And I, coming from the Central Coast of California, can't really understand the situation that's going on in interior Southern California. So I need to have relationships with the people there that can come and be those community leaders who can stand forth and have those relationships in those community spaces, taking our curriculum as a base and then co-designing it for their audiences because they know what their audiences need in a way that I could never possibly know. Also, as Greg mentioned, and this directly relates to recruitment, climate change is a massive multiplier of injustice. Every facet of injustice across the spectrum, socioeconomic spectrum, across the identity spectrum, across the place spectrum. And there are so many different levels of embedded experience and trauma throughout our world, not just our society here in the United States, that we really have to understand some people can't even spare a thought for climate because there are so many other things that take precedence in the importance of their lives and how they're trying to respond from their life experience, whether it's feeding their family, whether it's making sure that they have transportation to get to school, making sure that they have housing. So recognizing that these are very real and valid experiences that people are living in the conditions of helps us kind of better understand the recruitment. We might want to bring as many people as possible from different identity groups into our spaces, but it just might not be possible without removing some of those really significant barriers, like childcare. If you have young families that can't afford a babysitter or don't have someone they could even ask to babysit their children, having that person come and be present in a program that you're offering might just not be a reality they can accomplish unless you help to provide a vector for childcare to reduce that barrier. And as Greg mentioned right up front, as part of our guiding principles, it's really important to acknowledge that learning involves our whole person. It's not just an intellectual exercise. Every aspect of ourselves is present in every space that we enter into. And taking in new information, like, it's cognitive work. There's actually like energy being burned to learn, and that affects your physicality, that affects your psychology, that affects your ability to pay attention if you're so tired at the end of a workday. This can all drain your emotions in addition to your ability to pay attention or your ability to be physically present. And so as we open our perspectives and recognize all of these involved components, it can be really impactful for us as instructors, facilitators, conveners, when we start to think of how are we presenting our opportunities out there. Is it just convenient for us and our schedule, or is it actually looking at the community and the members of our audience that are going to be there, acknowledging their personhood and the presence that they're bringing into our spaces? Kind of interconnected with all of this, once you get those people in a room together, the relationships within the learning cohorts are really important for a sustained learning over time, but also for the success of remembering that learning. If you feel isolated in a room because nobody else looks like you, or there is a massive hidden curriculum that's occupying the space, you're expected to you're taking a naturalist class, so of course you hike and you have a hiking stick and hiking boots and binoculars, and so we're going to go off on this field trip next weekend and bring your stuff. Well, if you don't know about that hidden curriculum, if you've entered into this space because you're excited to learn more, but there's all this expectation around, we have to understand that we have to honor those identities, skills, and ways of knowing and being that each of us brings into those spaces. We can't assume. And really, we have to remember that we're all learning together, even the facilitator. I learn every single class I teach, almost every single interaction that I have as a person. I have intentionally taken on the mindset of I am a learner in every situation. How can I grow? How can I listen? How can I be present and sharing this experience with the people in community with me instead of being the sage on the stage who is a fountain of information that's only going in one direction. So we are super excited and super proud about our program. Throughout the state of California, we have over 70 active partners, and we are continuing to grow. But if you look at this state, you can see that there are definite places where we don't have partnerships actively happening. And part of the whole reason we have the 4 R's framework, why we're working so diligently around diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, is because we recognize that there's people that are not part of our program. There are people that we are not reaching, and we're trying to understand why. Is that because there is a financial barrier? Is that because there is a physical access barrier? Is that because what we have to provide is not relevant to that community or audience? Or maybe it is relevant, but we just don't have the right relationship in those spaces to kind of bring that information into those audiences and those communities. I think you can tell that Greg and I are pretty proud of the work that we do. As Greg mentioned, he's the director of our program. He is very focused on the California Naturalist program, and I am very focused on the Climate Stewards program. But together, we come together as a team with the rest of the team. We've got 3 other staff members that are part of this small but mighty machine that is connecting with folks across the state. CalNat has been around for about 10 years now, and we have about 5,000 or so certified California naturalists. Climate Stewards launched in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic lockdowns, but we already have 700 certified stewards. So that kind of gives you an idea how hungry people are for climate information. And our class is different than any other class that's out there because we recognize these guiding principles: systems thinking, place-shaped, whole person, centering diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice as a moral obligation. Because we are working to make sure that social emotional resilience and trauma-aware practices are an integral part of the work that we do and are bringing these audiences and communities together in a way that they are learning and growing and solidifying relationships that help strengthen them as they work to build resilience to climate disruption in both their communities and their ecosystem spaces. So this is just a really brief overview of the stuff that we're doing. We're excited to have this opportunity to kind of share it all with you. And we're really excited to have the opportunity to answer any questions that you might have. So I don't know if Rachel or Grace has picked up anything in particular, but we're happy to kind of switch gears for that now.
Thank you so much, Greg and Sarah May. That was great. A lot of food for thought for all of us. Yeah, we're getting a few questions in the chat, so we'll just sort of throw a few things at you and see what you have to say. Sarah May, this one we spoke about a little bit earlier. Sarah's asking, how do you recommend initiating contact with potential partners and begin building relationships? You talked about, sometimes we don't have those relationships yet, or there's folks that we're not currently reaching and maybe we're not sure why. Thoughts about sort of how to take those first steps?
That's a great and really important question. So the first step is to recognize that it's going to take time. So I'll share an example, and I'm sharing this specific example because it hasn't come to fruition yet. So we work with the California Volunteers California Climate Action Corps, and how that workforce development program works is that there are fellows placed in community organizations across the state of California to do climate work, actually to physically do climate work in communities. And one of our fellows, so the fellows then take our Climate Stewards course as part of their training. So one of the fellows was working with the Central Coast Environmental Justice Network. And we were really excited. This was an organization that professionals that we work with who are advisors to us had recommended, hey, this is a great organization. They're doing great work. You should connect with them. And so we reached out, saying, hey, Haley Retterer is a fellow. She's taking our class. We'd love to talk with you, learn a little bit more about you, tell you a little bit about us. These are the times where we can meet. And we didn't hear back. And then we heard back. And it was like, oh, great, we'd love to meet with you, but these times don't work with us. And actually, we as CCEJN want to take a step back because we don't know you. Like, you know a little bit about us, but we don't know really anything about you. We actually want to take a step further back just to be like, these are who we are as people. This is kind of the mission of both of our organizations. And before we talk about working with each other, let's just talk about who we are. And so we reached back out. We said, hey, we'd love to do that with you. We'd love to have this conversation. What are some times that work with you to meet? and then we didn't hear back. Now, that is in all likelihood due to the fact that they're a small organization. It was in summertime, which is one of their busiest times of the year. And so now, in my opinion, the ball is back in our court, kind of hit a lull in the season, kind of the end of the year is when a lot of people kind of wrap up loose ends. So it's on me to reach back out and say, hey, we kind of left this conversation hanging. We'd love to have the opportunity just to meet and talk and get to know each other a little bit more, and see how that goes. So it really is just the basics of like having coffee with someone to start those conversations, because you know, here we are, the University of California, we have this kind of big name behind us, and it is really easy to impose, you owe us something because we can do these things for you. That's not where we're coming from, but that can be a feeling in small organizations. And having been in a small organization before, you know, and fully acknowledging I'm a white, well-educated, very privileged woman, I know how that can feel. So thinking of an organization that is primarily staffed of people with color, you know, with a really small budget, doing really important things in their community, that expectation might feel overwhelming and like, nope, we're not going to do that right now because that's not where we want to go. So it really is, it's doing the work and not having expectations out there, but making yourself available for relationship building.
Thank
So I
you.
saw a few questions in the chat, and maybe I'll take a stab at a few of them, give Sarah May a quick rest there, and then Sarah May, you might want to take a look at some of the other questions that came in. I saw one about funding. Our program is funded from various sources. One of the, I think, unique things about our program is that we use a social franchise model that we've developed, which essentially it takes on elements of the franchise model you're probably familiar with, except there's no profit motive, there's a purpose motive. And what we do is basically we work with our local partners. Our local partners charge a fee for the course that they offer, whether it's the California Naturalist course or the Climate Stewards course. They set their own course fee for the participants, and participants pay that fee. And then they remit a small program fee to us for each participant that goes through their program. It varies from about 10 to 20% of their total costs for the program. And that actually is an important source of sustainable revenue for us. And it recognizes the value that we bring as the backbone organization to this larger network of partner organizations that we work with. So our own program generated revenues from course fees or program fees is one source. We have a small amount of funding from our organization, the UC, University of California, that covers my position, for example. And occasionally they give us temporary allocations to grow our staff a little bit. But we're also very reliant and dependent on grants, private gifts, contracts increasingly. So really all of those sources of funding come into play to support our program. There was another question in about training and what kind of training we're engaged in to maybe learn more about some of these things. We have a combination of in-house trainings that are provided for UC employees and for our organization in particular. Some of those are, most of us are participating in those. Some are required, some are optional, but we encourage our team to pursue all of those. We have external training opportunities that we encourage our participants, our staff to participate in. You may have heard of the IDI, Cultural Inventory related to cultural competency. I've gone through that. That was one that I chose to pursue and went through that, found it very helpful. Other staff have pursued other training opportunities, and we typically have a small budget to support their professional learning outside of our core program offerings. One thing I'll add that has been really important is that we, as part of this kind of responsibility part of our 4 Rs, we established a monthly DEIJ meeting with our team. We have one person on our team that this kind of responsibility is built into their job description. In fact, their job description was actually written to include addressing DEIJ and building new partnerships. But this individual facilitates a monthly meeting. We'll suggest various topics, things we come across during the month, and we'll discuss them as a team. And that's been really important for our team to kind of stay abreast of things that are going on. So that's a quick response to funding and training. And Sarah May, I don't know if you want to take, there was a question on the difference between the two courses content-wise. If you want to do that real quick, or if you want me to cover that, I can.
Yeah, so there were 2 questions I'll try to answer. So the content from the existing naturalist program at the steps for training staff, and I'll put in instructors there, but also how do you address burnout? So 3 questions in one. So, and I'll provide some additional documentation with more details after this. Our course, the Climate Stewards course, is structurally different than any other climate course that we know of. The first thing we talk about is relationships. We don't talk about climate. We talk about experiences and perceptions of climate change. We talk about trauma-aware practices. We talk about what are the definitions of community. We talk about language and how we talk to each other. That's unit 1. That's a whole week. The second thing we talk about is communication. Again, like, we're not talking about climate science. We're talking about how do we talk to each other. We talk about the science of communication, the cognitive science of communication, the psychology behind who listens, who doesn't, what is cognitive dissonance, what is confirmation bias, what are evidence-based ways of communicating with people. It's not until the 3rd unit that we get into the broad overview of what the climate is. And then the next unit, we get into the specifics of local and like systems, human systems, ecosystems. And then our 5th unit, we do community resilience. We talk about very intensely DEIJ and policies and procedures and social vulnerability and outreach. And then the last thing we talk about is community of practice. Where do we go beyond this class together? The naturalist program is literally plants, rocks, animals, all that good stuff, super important stuff. Don't get me wrong, I've done that my entire life. I'm a scientist. But we bring in the social, emotional, and all of the other aspects of climate into our class in a way that others don't. To do that, to have our instructors be successful, we do a train the trainer course where we teach them how do people process information? What are you going to do when somebody has a freak out in class because they've experienced a climate-related trauma? Like, we teach our instructors how we process this, how to deal with this themselves, how to form a support group of their peers. Like, we do all this in our instructor offering. And then that also is related to the burnout. We give people this connection. We currently have 70 instructors from 35 organizations across the state that are trained, and we connect them. We have an online space where they can talk to each other, they can share guest speakers, they can talk about syllabuses, and then we bring our instructors together 4 times a year. We have quarterly instructor calls, and in those calls, we do breakout sessions where we address different things that the instructors have brought forward as something that they want to talk about or that they need to address. And I have behind me, so I wouldn't forget, our course textbook. We actually specifically wrote this to be a help for that emotional burnout issue. So this is all about solutions. So it's climate stewardship, taking collective action to protect California. So north to south, east to west, ocean to desert. This is stories of people in urban, rural, ag, indigenous who are doing things right now, have been doing things for years to make a difference for climate change. So this is like the how I feel better about what life is. But then we also make recommendations on things like this. So this is the Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. You probably have heard of this by Sarah Jaquette Ray. So we recommend texts and things to our instructors to help strengthen kind of their overall professional capabilities as they come into teaching our class.
Maybe a couple other quick ones, and then Emily and Rachel, if you see other questions we've missed. But there was a question about how botanical gardens can address climate change, maybe directly or specifically. And I'll just throw out, we in our programs have a requirement for a class community or participatory science or citizen science course, if you will. We use the term participatory science as an umbrella term for all of those. There's a really good one. There's the National Phenology Networks program. I think phenology studies would be a great opportunity for botanical gardens to kind of connect climate change to the work that they do. We've talked to some botanical gardens that have talked about native and invasive species in the context of climate change. Looking at changing plant hardiness zones. I don't know. I'm not an ag person myself, but another one that seems to be really critical is just the very direct relationship between increasing temperatures and increasing evapotranspiration. And how that affects plants. It's like even though in California, even though it's unclear the trend in the direction or long-term trend in precipitation, we know that even if precipitation remains the same or even increases slightly, the increasing temperatures are really going to drive more drought through that enhanced evaporation and evapotranspiration. So that might be another important thing to consider. And there was one other question about how do we reach out to and start these new relationships. I think we use all sorts of approaches. We're very opportunistic. I gave a presentation, or I led a panel at a conference recently, and got to meet a gentleman on our panel that we have not worked with before. That's part of the Amamutsun tribe on the coast around Santa Cruz area. He gave a fantastic presentation, started a conversation, and that's the beginning, that's the seed, and hopefully that conversation leads to maybe a course or him participating as a guest speaker in one of our courses. Sometimes we're proactive, and we'll come across organizations that we know are serving a diverse audience, and we'll reach out to them, introduce ourselves. And that often takes a long time before anything really arises from it, but that's how we get things started. We also look at gaps, mostly geographic gaps in the coverage of our program. We were looking at inland Monterey County recently. There's a group there that does work with farm workers, and we're hoping that we can partner with them and fill a gap in our coverage across the state. So various approaches to kind of reaching out, from some that are very planned to some that are entirely opportunistic.
Great. We have another few questions if you'd be willing to answer. One of them is, can you give us a snapshot or two of some of your most memorable instances of co-design work that you've seen in California or elsewhere when it comes to climate change engagement? And it sounds like there's a lot of that in some of these books that you've recommended, but maybe some of your favorites?
Yeah, so I'll give you a couple examples. Sarah May might chime in. We've been working with an indigenous high school in the LA area. It's the Anahuac School. And we actually started with one of their partner organizations, the Audubon Center at Debs Park. And we kind of got connected to the high school, and the high school was interested in the program. And so the ball started rolling, and as we were going along, kind of talking about the course, the core requirements, and then developing the content for that context, which we really haven't done a specific high school course before. We realized that they had a very strong emphasis in decolonizing education as part of their approach to teaching their students. And we had to go through the content on the Canvas learning management system, almost word by word, and where they would suggest changes to make the content more consistent. And honestly, it was a real challenge for us. We also have certain things that we find are essential to the character of our course. And we have to be able to kind of go back and forth. Okay, does that change the program too much, or is that okay? It's the core content or concept is there. We're changing the terms that we use. We're acknowledging the concerns that they have, and that was a multi-month process. In fact, it's still ongoing. But that was a big one. Another one was with the tribal group, Wishtoyo, that serves mostly Chumash tribes in that area in Southern California along the coast, and they really changed up the whole focus, and just not only the way the content, but the delivery. So they decided they wanted to do most of the delivery online. They didn't want individuals to read the books themselves individually. They read the books online on a Facebook, video group with each person taking turns, and then they
Out loud,
and then they did a real emphasis throughout the reading of the book on the local indigenous knowledge related to the content they were covering as they covered the book. So they were basically integrating indigenous knowledge as they were going through the book. And then they did this entire 7-day field immersion that they added. So they went well beyond the requirements of the course when they designed theirs. I'll just give one more example. We've been working a lot lately with workforce development organizations, the California Conservation Corps in particular. We recently received a grant from the CNRA, California Natural Resources Agency, where we're working with California Conservation Corps members, and we're focusing their experience on both natural and cultural resources in the areas where they're working. So it's kind of expanding our program a little bit to not only cover the natural resources, but the cultural resources. So we had to work with all of our partners that were delivering those courses to these core members, so that they would incorporate more systematically cultural resources and the importance of cultural resources, getting additional guest speakers. We added 2 youth co-instructors to those courses, and we had to do a separate training for them. So that was another real co-design process that we went through for one of our courses.
Yeah, I'll just add, one of the most significant for me with Climate Stewards is an instructor down at Pasadena City College, and he has been a science instructor for like 25 years. And he was teaching our CalNat class. He's one of our like most prolific instructors because like he does the class twice a year, brings all these students through. So he came to our Climate Stewards training, which is very different than our California Naturalist training. And then he went back and he started, again, he was one of our first classes, pilot classes, in the middle of the pandemic. So our material's online, and the way it's structured is you do the online stuff by yourself, and then you come back together like an in-person space, and you discuss, you advance, make it local. So what he realized after the first few weeks is, one, he wanted to restructure how he taught all of his science classes. But 2, that having that group online space wasn't working for his students, because in the middle of the pandemic, going through a climate class, learning all this stuff, the students were not responsive in a group setting, but they'd be responsive to him in office hours. And so he'd have like this class and nobody would say or do anything, like blank looks. And then 2 days later, he'd have office hours and he'd have these college students coming to him, like breaking down, crying, trying to figure out solutions, wanting to know, like, what do I do? How do I implement? What's my next goal? And so he restructured how he did his class. He got rid of those like class sessions and multiplied his office hours. So essentially he was having that one-on-one time to deal with the implications of the social, emotional stuff while we were living through the shared global trauma of the pandemic. And then subsequently, after teaching that class, he restructured almost all of his science classes to bring in trauma-aware practices, social emotional experience, because an environmental science teacher, you are learning about the degradation, the impact, like all of these things all the time. And what we're finding is that more and more people, young millennials and Gen Z, are literally like having mental breakdowns because they see no future for themselves. They don't even want to go to college. They don't want to even plan for a future because they see no future. And so this was a way that he restructured all of his school offerings based on what we had provided him as like professional development in the background and then his experience during the pandemic. So you can see kind of from these examples, they can, you know, instructors can do just about anything to address the needs of their audience.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to hear some concrete examples, and those were really interesting. Thanks. So today's participants are mostly public garden educators who are either interested or already engaged in climate change education programming. And I'm wondering, sort of as a final thought that you might have for that audience, do you have any parting wisdom that comes to mind, maybe a piece of advice you wish someone had given you, or something that you've had to learn over time that you think could be helpful for this audience as public gardens educators to be kind of considering as we're thinking about getting started in this area?
Really briefly, because I know we're at time, I will say gardening is science. And I grew into a young scientist with my hands in the dirt with my great-grandmother. Flat out.
I think maybe I'm hearing the question a little bit differently, but I would say that this is really an ongoing process. If we're talking about the process of developing climate change education programming that's centered around diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. We are continuously learning in our program, and we're changing things as we learn. Nobody has arrived with the solutions at this point. It's an ongoing process. You just need to make a commitment to doing it, like we have a commitment to hiring the personnel that have the knowledge and the skills and the background, a commitment to setting your internal metrics for and accountability, meeting regularly, continue to learn, and just keep at it, because these relationships, they take time. Building those relationships take time, and if you're in a rush, it's not going to happen, or it's not going to turn out well. So I would just say, approach it as if you are in something for the long haul, and I think things will work out the best.
Thank you. Great advice. We really appreciate it. And thanks so much, Sarah, May, and Greg, for such a wonderful discussion today. And thanks to everyone who attended our program and asked such great questions. It's been really interesting to hear what people asked and what you both had to say. So we really appreciate your time and expertise.